Yeah.
Wouldn't the violent toppling of the Syrian government directly benefit ISIS?
The toppling of the Assad government benefit ISIS?
That would be directly to the benefit of ISIS.
Look, I'm not going to speculate about what would or what wouldn't benefit Daesh. I mean, to some degree, and the Secretary's talked about this, there's a symbiosis between the Assad regime and Daesh, and he said that many, many times. It is through Assad's brutality that Daesh has been able to fester and grow into ungoverned spaces. And one of the things that we've talked about routinely, although we haven't said it, we haven't talked about it recently, is that we understand that while the future of Syria cannot include Bashar al-Assad, as we work through this political process to a transitional governing body, we recognize that some institutions of government, for instance, the security forces, in some form or fashion, has got to stay intact, so that there isn't a complete collapse of an appropriate governing infrastructure inside the country as we work through this very difficult transitional process.
If the Syrian government were to just immediately fall, what would happen to Syrian Christians? What would happen to Syrian Alawites?
Look, I'm not going to engage in hypotheticals about a situation that we're actually obviously trying to avoid. It isn't about the fall of the regime. We are trying to get to a transitional process of governance that preserves even some of the existing infrastructure going forward, but that at the end of that process gets us to a government that is put in place by the Syrian people, with their voices being heard, and it doesn't include Bashar al-Assad.
This does not represent what the American people want. All the polls show that the American people don't want a new war. The American people are sick and tired of our money being wasted on bombs and weapons and destruction, provoking a war with China, provoking a war with Russia, while our trains are derailing, people in the United States are suffering, our water's not being purified, our railroads are falling apart, our power grids are falling apart, and yet we pour more and more weapons and money into some stupid confrontation with China. China is not our enemy. Wall Street bankers are our enemy. No more provocations against China. China is not our enemy. 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 Get out of our country. Stop trying to sell war in our country. Stop trying to sell war in our country. We don't want a new war with China. We love America and we don't want a new war with China. China is not our enemy. Stop trying to sell war. Get out of our country. Stop trying to sell war. China is not our enemy. I'm a patriotic American. I love my country and I don't want World War III.
Repeatedly from this podium, when asked about the situation in Aleppo, you advised people here to turn on their TVs, watch American television. Do you stand by that? Do you still recommend people do that if they want to learn credible reports about what's happening in Aleppo?
Oh, I think you're grossly mischaracterizing my comments. I didn't say that the only way to get informed about Aleppo is to turn on your TV. I was referring to questions about people dancing in the streets. And I didn't deny, unlike what's been out there on Twitter, I didn't deny that there aren't images of people that may have been happy about what happened in Aleppo. I said I hadn't seen them, which at the time I hadn't. But I also encourage people to look at news coverage, the broad swath of news coverage about what's going on in Aleppo, and I think you can see that through the imagery that's being conveyed, mostly by television news coverage, but not only, you can see the devastation that's being wrought on the people of Aleppo and the innocent men, women, and children that are still there, that still are trying to get out and still haven't received any humanitarian aid. So let's not oversimplify what I said.
Well, let me ask you, one of the things that was highlighted on American television was these final messages from people, right? They were tweeting out, this is their final message. As soon as the city is liberated, we're going to be killed. And these messages turned out to not be final messages. I mean, not a single one of these people ended up being slaughtered. So is it still credible to watch American media?
Well, I talk about a loaded question. So I don't know. Maybe you have specific knowledge about every person that sent a tweet.
I have some specifics here if you want to get into that.
No.
Okay.
If you let me finish,
Sure.
then we can have this conversation. Maybe you have more knowledge about the individuals tweeting. I don't. And my goodness, if every single person that thought they were going to die at the hands of the Syrian armed forces with the support of Russia, didn't die. Are you claiming that's a bad thing? I think that's a pretty darn good thing. So I can't speak for the fact that some may have survived and some didn't, but the fact that they believed it at the time and were honestly scared about their lives and the livelihoods of their friends and family seemed pretty legitimate to me based on the social media interaction that I saw. If that didn't happen to them, then I think that's terrific, obviously, and we should all be rejoicing in the fact that they were able to survive the onslaught and the siege and the surrender tactics of the regime and its backers. Now, as for the American media, yeah, I think the reporting coming out of Aleppo, some of what we're seeing is pretty darn courageous reporting, pretty brave, and I think it's pretty important. I always advocate, whenever anybody asks me about media coverage, to read and digest a broad array of media, not just U.S. media, but foreign media as well. Take it all in, take all those sources, and make your own judgments. But absolutely, I think it's important that independent, third-party media coverage of whatever the issue is, and we're talking about Aleppo, it could be anything, is vital. It's vital to the public so that they can better understand what's going on. So if you're asking me if I think that following the U.S. media with respect to what's going on in Syria is important, the answer is absolutely yes.
One of the journalists who was quoted and featured across American mainstream media is Belil Abdul Karim. Here he is being interviewed. And this individual, we also have some of his other journalism. And here he is with someone, this is what he, in his words, describes as an explosive vest. And this is an interview he did with a fighter in an explosive vest. He reports, "The fighters are now preparing to leave the city. This is an explosive belt. This is what many fighters are wearing because they don't feel they can trust the regime." Is this an unbiased, credible source, this person standing next to what looks like a potential suicide bomber?
Look, I'm not going to speak to every single news account that you can sit there and cite, sir. What I can tell you is, as I said, I think the broad swath of coverage about what's going on in Syria is worth people paying attention to. And people have to decide for themselves what they're going to find credible and what they're not going to find credible. But if by the tone of your questioning or by the questions themselves you're trying to imply that what's going on in Aleppo is nothing more than a liberation festival or a parade of proud, happy people that they're being liberated, I think that is ludicrous. And I think it is not backed up by any stretch of normal independent reporting that we've seen coming out of there. Now, I'm not going to debate each and every account with you. I'm not going to get into an argument over each and every story that's been filed. But I think the travesty that has become Aleppo is clearly and should be squarely put on the regime's doorstep, as well as their backers in Russia and Iran.
No one denies that carnage.
With countries from the developing world having more prominence and importance in international affairs, do you feel that the United Nations could be restructured in a way that would give more representation to developing countries?
In the name of Allah, the Merciful, the Compassionate, I think the UN and its mechanisms. I will reiterate that the UN and its mechanisms need to be revised so that it can fulfill its role of enhancing peace, security and justice. And if the UN, the Security Council and the various UN branches are not revised, then I think that with the new centers of power that have emerged in the world, with the global coalitions and the developing countries, the role of the UN will diminish day by day, and it will certainly not be able to fulfill its role as before. And in our view, its position and condition of functioning will inevitably come to naught. We definitely need to reconsider its position, structure and condition of functioning.
Now, Your Excellency, my question to follow up from this is that as Iran has such a vibrant and beautiful history as a civilization, what do you foresee as the future of your country and its role in international affairs being?
Iran has a great past, a civilization, and this culture permeates the heritage of our country and our entire nation with its strong faith and religious beliefs. The rich civilizational past of the Iranian people, on the one hand, and their faith and the way they relate to divine values, on the other hand, has given birth to hope. And this hope will make the future brilliant. Today, this hope has emerged in the life of the Iranian people. The Islamic Republic is now following the path of progress, significant progress, despite the threats and sanctions that Iran's enemies have imposed and continue to impose. Today, with its faith and hope, the Iranian nation has been able to make the enemy falter and retreat. In my opinion, with this faith and hope, with Iran's past and its civilization, we can take confident steps towards growth and prosperity in the future.
Now, Iran is one of the 6 countries that was just invited to join the BRICS. And I'm curious as to why you believe this development occurred and what it is that Iran can offer to the BRICS nations.
Iran is a country with great potential. Iran has an extremely important geopolitical position. First, relations with the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. On the other hand, relations with Central Asia and Central Asian countries. The presence of many neighboring countries gives Iran certain opportunities. In addition to its geopolitical position, Iran has significant domestic potential as an energy and communications hub. Iran as a junction can interconnect the East and the West, the North and the South. Iran is a country with great capabilities and potential, the most important of which, however, are its people, full of faith and determination. Thanks to that, today it has been able to position itself, not only in the region but also in the world, as a leader of resistance against enemies. In fact, over these 40-plus years, the Iranian nation has shown that it can make an impact in the region and in the world. In the new world order that is now emerging, Iran is considered a key player. Iran occupies an important place in the emerging world order because the resistance movement in the region is linked to the name of Iran. Therefore, the potential that Iran possesses on the one hand and the potential that BRICS possesses on the other hand are coming together to form a powerful movement. I believe that the BRICS countries are just as important to Iran as Iran is important to the BRICS countries. This group is being formed to play a role in various fields, both regionally and internationally, especially in the field of trade and economy.
Iran has faced widespread criticism for its stance on the Ukraine conflict, with Kiev and its partners lashing out and criticizing Iran. What would you say to those who look on at this and it appears to be some kind of double standard? What do you have to say on this point?
Look, we are convinced that the war between Ukraine and Russia needs to come to an end as soon as possible. Most decisively, it will be good for all the parties. If we want to understand what had caused this war, it is NATO's desire to expand its influence on more countries and establish its presence and set up military bases not only in Ukraine, but in many other states. Naturally, what we observe now happening is Ukraine seriously increasing its capacities thanks to America and Europe, above all in terms of the military aid it receives. Naturally, this only pushes it to continue the war. Let's see who is to benefit from a prolonged war. Is it Ukraine? Is it perhaps Europe? Or is it those who are praying today for this war to go on? I am convinced that with regards to this issue, the Islamic Republic of Iran, above all, stands for facilitating the end of this war, playing a mediator's role between Russia and Ukraine if possible. However, all those who are today sending all sorts of aid, including financial and military aid to Ukraine, do not wish to end the war. They wish to protract it by any means possible. The Islamic Republic of Iran, due to the ample opportunities it now has at its disposal, has been blamed by the West, which is trying to throw in more accusations. We have given our response to these accusations on different forums. We said, if you have something to back up these accusations, please produce it. They have not been able to produce a single piece of evidence or proof of any kind. Today, we have no doubt that their strategy is to keep accusing the Islamic Republic in order to disparage it and set public opinion against it. But this trick, just like all the other tricks they have used against the Islamic Republic, won't help them.
Now, Washington recently arranged the unfreezing of billions of dollars of Iranian funds that had been frozen in South Korea. But now, Washington is threatening to freeze these funds once again because they disapprove of how Iran may be spending this money. What do you make of these moves from Washington? What is their intent? Does this seem like erratic behavior? Is there a strategy behind what they're doing?
You see, it wasn't fair when the funds were frozen, because they belong to the people of Iran. They shouldn't have frozen the funds. All the time the funds were frozen and the accounts arrested, this caused harm to the Iranian people. Now that the people of Iran again have access to these funds, we are spending them trying hard to take care of the needs of the Iranian people. But this American spirit of superiority, it was so typical of them to arrest our funds. Their sense of superiority allowed them to crack down on the Iranian people, to impose sanctions. Slapping nations with sanctions is so typical of the Americans and speaks of the uncurbed sense of superiority and tyranny that is at their core. Of course, Iran is a living witness of America's tyranny, both in terms of the American sanctions and in many other regards. I believe that our approach here and elsewhere involves perseverance, resistance, and standing our ground.
Now, I would like, if possible, for you to give us your assessment of the prospects and future of relations between Iran and Russia.
We have enjoyed long-standing relations with Russia in multiple areas, including politics, economics, trade, defense and security. And our cooperation is developing every day. Even the war in the region couldn't slow down our cooperation in multiple areas. Quite the opposite. The political will that prioritizes expanding our cooperation, particularly in the areas of trade and economy, as well as our partnership in the International North-South Transport Corridor Initiative and regional cooperation, pursues the development of our relations. Today's issues have had no impact on the relationship between Russia and Iran and never will. Our relationship with Russia is of strategic importance, and no developments on the global scene can change that.
Now, we understand your time is limited and you have many affairs to take care of, so we have just one final question. It's been a year since Iran was marked by a huge amount of unrest. And it's pretty clear the United States was backing this unrest and that there was a huge amount of media demonization of Iran broadcast around the world in the aftermath and during this unrest. What would you say to those who have seen these reports in Western media and have a negative image of Iran in their mind as a result of these portrayals? What would you like them to know that they have not been told?
I think enough time has passed since then, a full year, so we can better see the situation, the setting, and what happened behind the scenes. Even those who had no information and were misled by the media and their false news can now see the facts and understand the essence of what happened. The United States and its European allies tried to ride the wave. They thought they could strike the Islamic Republic at that moment. On gender issues, for example, and on economic issues. They started a hybrid war against the Islamic Republic of Iran. But after a little while, we saw the Iranian people prevail in that war. So the Iranian people was victorious again. When I spoke at the UN, I said that the Iranian people had won this hybrid war and had been able to secure this victory in the situation created by Iran's enemies. The hostile media, psychological, economic and political pressures. As you can see for yourself today, all the opponents, all the enemies of Iran, although they made an attempt to bring back at least the memory of the events of a year ago, they did not succeed. They failed completely. And the people who had any doubts that the enemies of Iran were behind this, the enemies who sought to put the Iranian Republic through hardship, can now see clearly that the Islamic Republic of Iran is not a weak sapling, but a strong tree that will not bow under these blows. The roots of the Islamic Republic are very deep. They did not begin yesterday. Over the years, we have become accustomed to hearing what the United States, some other Western countries and detractors have to say to the Islamic Republic. Each time, they give us 6 months. Since the victory of the Islamic Revolution, every year they say that in 6 months, the situation in the Islamic Republic will change. I suppose it has now been about 80 times 6 months since they started saying that. It has been demonstrated to them that the Islamic Republic is a powerful state, a state that is now stronger than ever. In the meetings I had with some of the media and political pundits during my 2 days in New York, they admitted that it has been proven to everyone that the Islamic Republic, in the words of yours truly, will not bow. And this time, just like previous times, they failed. I hope that this time they've realized that the Islamic Republic is a powerful state, and most importantly, that God Almighty is looking after us. And with the faith of our people, with their hopes and trust, and what is important is that, as the leader of the Islamic Revolution has repeatedly emphasized, it is not lies that are the basis for the continuation of the revolution, but the faith and the hopes of our people. Indeed, the revolution continues because of the faith and hopes of the people, which I have shared with you and all the esteemed viewers today. And a nation that is beloved and faithful is indeed a religious nation, and a nation that has hope. And a nation that is beloved and faithful is indeed a religious nation, and a nation that has hope. There is hope for the future, and a very bright future.
Caleb, we just showed your interview that you did back in September 2023 with the Iranian president. What were some of your impressions of the man?
Well, it was really an honor to sit down with him back in September because I've covered a number of American elections. You know, I asked Donald Trump a question at one of his press conferences. And when I spoke with the head of state of the Islamic Republic, I was speaking to somebody of a completely different brand, a completely different category. I mean, this was a deeply religious man. This was a longtime clerical figure in Iran, a judge, a legal scholar. This was someone who took the history of his country and the project of carrying out the Islamic Revolution and national rejuvenation very seriously. And every answer that he gave me came from a place of a very sophisticated understanding of geopolitics and really, I should say, a more Eastern approach and a more long-term approach to how one should govern a country. He wasn't worried about sound bites and scandal and gossip and rumors and all the stuff we hear from American and Western leaders. He was focused on kind of a long-term vision of how the Eastern parts of the world could come together. He was very excited about cooperating with Russia, cooperating with China. He was very critical of the United States and how it's destabilized and meddled in Iran's internal affairs. It was quite a conversation, and it was really an honor to speak with him. And I really wish that American audiences could understand how our leaders are kind of out of touch with how figures like him govern in different parts of the world.
Well, speaking of the sort of vision that President Raisi had for Iran, what would you say was the significance of his election back in 2021?
Well, he came on the heels of Iranian President Rouhani, who was a reformist, who was seen as being more sympathetic to the United States and had come to power on a platform of saying that if he carried out the Iran nuclear deal and negotiated with the United States, that would improve things for the Islamic Republic. And Rouhani, his predecessor, was proved devastatingly wrong because the Iran nuclear deal was signed and the USA ripped it up. And not only did they betray the deal, but then they murdered Qasem Soleimani, the top Iranian general, military figure, national hero. So when Raisi was elected, it was very much seen as a repudiation of kind of the reformist policies and a real reiteration of the principles of the Islamic Republic and the Islamic Revolution, the anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist principles. I mean, he called himself a principalist. His critics called him a hardliner, but he said he was a principalist, and he was reasserting the principles on which the Islamic Republic was founded. And that's particularly important right now because Iran is very much a target of Israel because of their support for the Palestinians. And support for the Palestinians was something that he was very firm, and he was kind of leading the country to kind of hold itself together in the face of the murder of Qasem Soleimani and more recently the brutal attack on the Iranian consulate in Damascus. And so it's important to understand him in that light. He came to power as a repudiation of figures who had tried to conciliate with the United States and then gotten slapped in the face.
Well, of course, we have very little official information right now. We don't know if there were any foreign powers involved in this incident involving Raisi. But what do you think that it could mean for Tehran and its foreign relations in the region and beyond, as well as domestically?
Well, the fact that already all over Iran there is suspicion of Israeli involvement, American involvement, that reflects what Iran has been subjected to for decades. criminal economic sanctions, the funding of destabilization movements to try and tear the country apart. The Mujahideen at Khalq, which was considered for years to be a terrorist organization that conducted assassinations and worked with Saddam Hussein. They are openly celebrated by the U.S. government and promoted by top American politicians. And let's not forget, 1988, you had an Iranian civilian aircraft that was shot down by the United States. And U.S. President Reagan and later U.S. President Bush refused to apologize for shooting down this civilian aircraft. So the fact that there's widespread suspicion that the American government or the Israeli government could have been involved, based on what Iran has faced since its revolution, and most especially in recent months and recent years, that's not really surprising. It would fit what Iran has been subjected to, and it would kind of, it would match the pattern of attacks on Iranian leaders, assassination of prominent Iranian national heroes and political figures like Qasem Soleimani. So I think people should understand that such suspicion, this isn't just internet conspiracy theories. It kind of matches a pattern of how that country has been treated.
Well, just to add on what you just mentioned there, Caleb, we just got official confirmation from the vice president of Iran that Raisi, unfortunately, has been confirmed killed as a result of this incident. But that was RT correspondent Caleb Maupin. Thanks a lot for bringing us those details.
Indeed.
How did this stop? This was a great moment. June 30th, 2019. The leader of People's Korea and the leader of the United States shook hands. They met, the first president ever to visit the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. We had Donald Trump trying to make peace with a country that is still technically at war with the United States. Donald Trump was trying to open the door to peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula. There would be hope to bring the troops home from South Korea. There would be hope that there could be denuclearization, that North Korea wouldn't feel threatened anymore, that there could be no more bombs and weapons, and the people of Korea could reunify. And Donald Trump going to People's Korea was sabotaged. It was sabotaged by John Bolton and the neocons, the same forces that got us into Ukraine, the same forces that are escalating and pushing buttons against China and Taiwan on the Taiwan Strait, the same forces that want World War III sabotaged the peace process on the Korean Peninsula. We're here to say, finish what Trump started. We want peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula. We want U.S. leaders and the leaders of People's Korea to sit down. We would like to see trade between the United States and People's Korea. We would like to see those railroads in South Korea that have been built. We'd like to see them in action and see the Korean people trading with each other. We don't want war. We don't want money wasted on international confrontations. And we also don't want a police state. And at the same time that the big bankers who control Joe Biden, the Silicon Valley monopolists and fascists, the same forces that control Joe Biden, are waging a war not just around the world, but against the American people. They are driving our country into poverty. Our trains are derailing. People are breathing in deadly chemicals. The water is not properly purified. Jobs are falling apart. Schools are falling apart. It's a nightmare. They have waged a war against us. And instead of rebuilding America, they're trying to move toward a low-wage police state. That's what they're doing here in the United States. They're trying to move toward a low-wage police state. We saw what happened, what's been revealed about January 6th. That was a setup. We saw that those people were led to do what they did for propaganda purposes. We call for an amnesty. We don't endorse what the people did, but they were enabled to do it and set up to do it by the American government. The FBI, the Secret Service, other agencies enabled what happened on January 6th to happen. Those folks were entrapped. And we say that until they're going to be honest with the public about what really happened on January 6th, there needs to be an amnesty for those who've been arrested. And the same goes for the Uhuru movement. A group of black revolutionaries, black activists, had guns pointed in their faces, drones flown into their homes. They were terrorized and accused of being Russian agents. Why? Because they were organizing for the rights of black people, organizing for the rights in their community, providing services that were not available in their community. They're waging a war against us. At the same time, they're waging a war against China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, and any country that dares break out of their financial system. And it is our responsibility to oppose it and to join arm in arm with the people of the world against imperialism.
Please switch it.
The Russian Ministry of Defense says that in Aleppo there was recently a chemical weapons attack and that it was conducted by the Harakat Nur al-Zenki organization, which is an opposition group that has received support from the United States. Is the United States still supporting this organization?
So unaware of that allegation. The only thing I'm aware of is the alleged chemical weapons attack on the town of Syria. I think we're talking about separate incidents. If I'm correct, I don't know.
I'm referring to something in Aleppo.
You're talking about something in Aleppo. So haven't seen those reports. Obviously, as we said with the incident that took place, I think 2 days ago, allegedly, there were reports of chemical weapons being used in another town. But the same would hold true with this. Is obviously we condemn strongly the use of any chemical weapons, and any credible allegations of their use in Syria will investigate. And I believe it's the purview of the OPCW that would carry out such an investigation. As to your follow-on question about this group, I don't have in front of me that we actually fund them. I mean, you're saying we provide them with assistance?
Yes, as part of the so-called moderate opposition.
Yeah. I don't know what.
Now, the group
again,
also.
I haven't seen the allegations yet, so I think it's too early for me to A, make that assessment, and B, make that connection.
It's been said that the State Department is also investigating allegations. I mean, there's a video of this group beheading a 10-year-old Palestinian
Yes.
boy.
Yeah, I'm aware of
how are
that.
those investigations going? Has there been any result?
Yeah, so we did talk about that. We were looking into those that incident. Obviously, we condemned if it were true. I know that the group itself said that they had also made some arrests and then set up a commission of inquiry into the incident. I don't have any updates at this point in time, but I can certainly check and get back to you.
So what does a rebel group in Syria have to do to not receive U.S. funds any longer? What is the line that they must cross? What kind of controversial incident must take place for a group to stop receiving U.S. funds?
Well, first of all, there's a lot of vetting of the Syrian moderate opposition that has already taken place. And it's not just by the U.S., but it's by all the members of the ISSG and, frankly, the UN. And it was established that al-Nusra, as well as Daesh or ISIL, were considered to be, by all members and by the UN, to be terrorist organizations. I think, again, these are not easy processes, and one incident here and there would not necessarily make you a terrorist group. Now, let me be very clear that we don't condone any of the activities that you just cited, possible use of chemical weapons, possible beheading of a young child, any human rights abuses, any of those things would give us serious cause for concern. That said, where we are in the broader geopolitical or political situation in Syria is, and one of the ongoing discussions that we've been having with Russia, is how do we clearly delineate between these known terrorist groups, Nusra and Daesh, and the moderate opposition? And how do we have a clear understanding of who is where so that we can, longer game here, get back in place a cessation of hostilities that is credible, that can also then jumpstart the political process.
So it sounds to me like what you're saying is that even if these allegations are true, there's still a chance that the United States would continue supporting these groups. Is that what you're saying?
I'm not making any, I'm not frankly answering any hypotheticals. We just don't know at this point. As I said, we would regard any of the acts that you mentioned or cited, and again, they are just allegations at this point. We take them very seriously and look into them and investigate them.
They're not a red line
Again,
and U.S. support.
So for a terrorist organization, there are fundamental actions, one of which is an intention to carry out terrorist attacks, both within Syria, but as well as on the West. Some of these groups, as I said, Nusra and Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda is al-Nusra, they're one and the same, and Daesh have expressed and indeed acted on these intentions. But as to the other members of the moderate Syrian opposition, look, we're constantly evaluating their behavior, and frankly, for them to be a member of the moderate Syrian opposition and to be part of the cessation of hostilities and the Syrian democratic forces,
it requires that they meet the standards. And those standards are respect for human rights and adherence to a cessation of hostilities.
And does that include not using chemical weapons? Is that part of the standard?
Of course.
So you're still looking into the chemical weapons charges?
Yes. Yeah, I don't have any
back and
updates
forth?
on that.
There's no-
Yeah.
Just to be clear, if a group was using chemical weapons, their funding would be cut off.
Again, I will not make any statements of one or the other until we know all the facts and have determined who was to blame for any. I mean, honestly, it's the first time I'm hearing about a report for use of chemical weapons. But again, we have also seen reports of the use of chemical weapons on another town, and we're looking into that. So, I mean, again, we just don't have.
Have a policy not to support groups that use chemical weapons?
We condemn the use of chemical weapons.
Yes, but do you have a policy of not supporting groups that do such things?
Again, we would evaluate any support for any groups that are engaged in any kind of activity that, frankly, go against international norms.
Okay, so let's move on from Asia. What do we have now? Okay, let's go to Syria then. Sir, I'm sorry, tell me your name.
Oh, I'm Caleb with RT.
Caleb
Maupin.
Oh, right, Caleb.
So, this recent statement from the White House alleging that the Syrian government was planning an upcoming chemical attack. Are you concerned that that could have created an opening for terrorist groups to carry out a chemical attack?
No.
You're not concerned, even though al-Nusra, al-Qaeda groups have been using chemical weapons in Syria? That's documented?
No. Next question on Syria.
Well, I mean, they could carry out a chemical attack, and then with the White House saying, oh, Assad was going to do it, that would create a cover for them to do such a thing.
Do I have to do this again? We know that Assad has used chemical weapons on his own people, and he's done that repeatedly.
Well, hasn't the United States convinced the world that
including
Saddam Hussein
women
had
and
weapons of mass
children,
destruction?
and we have all seen that. We have all seen the video, and there is no debate about that. Okay,
So
I'm going to.
didn't Assad give up his chemical weapons in 2013? Didn't that happen?
No.
That didn't
Havy,
happen, so the
Havy, let's
OPCW
go
is
over
not
to you.
being-
Anything else on Syria? Yeah.
You said before, are you saying that al-Qaeda has not used chemical weapons?
I'm not going to get into this conversation with you
Well,
about
this is a
this because
concern.
no. You want to have a debate, okay, about a hypothetical, okay, and I'm not going to get into a debate.
If you announce that there's a pending chemical attack,
I'm not going to get into a debate about a hypothetical, but what
if you announce that, then they could carry out an attack, and it would look like the government did it. I mean, isn't that a real possibility?
If you want to try to make excuses for the Assad regime, go
I'm
right
not talking
ahead.
about
You've
Assad,
got a
I'm
lot
talking
of
about
cameras on you
terrorist
right
groups.
now.
I'm talking about al-Qaeda and
Okay, and I'm
al-Nusra.
not going to spend all our folks' time having that conversation. We all know here in this room that Bashar al-Assad is responsible for chemical attacks on his own people, including women and
And
children.
isn't al-Qaeda
We are
also-
not going to
isn't
debate
al-Qaeda
it
responsible for such
beyond
things?
that. Al-Qaeda, horrible too, but
Uses
what we're
chemical
talking about
weapons?
right now is Assad and Syria.
Well,
Okay,
I asked you about al-Qaeda.
Next
That's
question.
what I was asking for clarification.
Something else on Syria? Okay, let's go to Russia.
What's bizarre is she's trying to frame herself as Miss Black Lives Matter, when in reality, Kamala Harris was the queen of mass incarceration. Kevin Cooper was hours away from receiving lethal injection. Hours away from it. His lawyers asked that DNA evidence be acquired in order to make sure he was actually guilty of the crime. And Kamala Harris's office tried to prevent DNA evidence from being acquired. They wanted Kevin Cooper to be executed, but the governor of California disagreed. They acquired DNA evidence, and the execution was stopped. The New York Times tells us that she feels really bad about it, for whatever that means. And people can also recall that while she was head of the California State Attorney General's office, over 1,000 people were locked up for smoking marijuana. She presided over jailing a lot of people. And on top of that, the drug labs in the state of California that were being used by the police were turning up false positive results. And yet, Kamala Harris's office did not tell the defense attorneys or the judges about this. They knew that the drug labs were turning over false positives, and people went to prison because her office concealed that their drug labs were turning up false positives. And another thing about Kamala Harris, I don't know if people saw, but there's a video of Kamala Harris where she's bragging about how she jailed the parents of children who were truant from school.
I would not be standing here were it not for the education I received. And I know many of us will say the same thing. And I believe a child going without an education is tantamount to a crime. So I decided I was going to start prosecuting parents for truancy. Well, this was a little controversial in San Francisco. And frankly, my staff went bananas. They were very concerned because we didn't know at the time whether I was going to have an opponent in my re-election race. But I said, look, I'm done. This is a serious issue, and I've got a little political capital, and I'm going to spend some of it.
Have you seen the clip? And she gets up there, and it's the same kind of thing. She's giggling. Yes, I had the idea that we could lock up parents who are truant from school. You know, I wouldn't be anywhere in my life if it weren't for my education, and so not giving a child their education is a crime, and so I jailed parents, and she's giggling about it. It's just so great. And, you know, I see so much in U.S. media. They like to trivialize incarceration. There's so many shows on Netflix and all of that where it ends towards the end where someone goes to jail, but it's part of the happy ending. It's okay. And they don't seem to realize what that means. You know, when one member of a family, when a father or a mother goes to prison, or a brother or a sister, it hurts the entire family. And when Kamala Harris is up there giggling about, oh, you know, I locked up these parents because their kids weren't in school. You know, yeah, kids need to be in school. When kids aren't getting to school, it's a problem. But the worst thing you could do is then throw their parents in jail. That's not going to help the situation in any conceivable way. But when she's joking about it, and she's laughing about it, Kamala Harris, she says, what did she say? She said, well, I wouldn't be anywhere if it wasn't for my education. It's about her. The big line when she was calling out Joe Biden, when she was trying to contend with Joe Biden in the presidential election, what did she shout at Joe Biden? She shouted, that little girl was me!
You know, there was a little girl in California who was part of the second class to integrate her public schools. And she was bused to school every day. And that little girl was me.
And then her campaign started churning out T-shirts with the face of 10-year-old Kamala Harris on them. Do you remember this? Yes. It's almost like she wants us to vote for her because she was once a 10-year-old child. I mean, that's what it sounds like. What's particularly interesting is, you know, you remember when Barack Obama was running for president. We knew everything about Barack Obama. We knew all about Barack Obama's pastor. We knew about Barack Obama's father from Kenya. We knew the school he went to in Indonesia. But Kamala Harris, barely anybody knows anything about Kamala Harris. Well, Kamala Harris's mother, who's now deceased, was from India, was a cancer researcher. And Kamala Harris's father, Donald Harris, was a Marxist economist, and is a Marxist economist, a professor at Stanford University. He was an advisor to the government of Michael Manley in Jamaica, and he and Kamala are estranged from one another. He did not attend Kamala's inauguration as vice president. They're not on good speaking terms. But the more you look at it, it's very clear that Kamala Harris sees herself as a victim. The way Kamala Harris speaks, the world has been unfair to her. And she blames Donald Harris for that to some degree or other. We don't know why. We also, there's rumors, we don't really know what happened when she was in Quebec. We just know she never talks about the years that she spent in Quebec. But Kamala Harris thinks that she is a victim. And she wants the whole world to know that that little girl was her. And she wants vengeance. And she wants to make people pay. And she wanted to make Kevin Cooper pay. And she wanted to make those parents pay. That's what leftism is if it's stripped of economics. If it's stripped of class struggle, if it's stripped of a desire to have the people rise up and control the means of production, if it's just anger, if it's just revenge, it's just a call for destruction, a call for rebellion, that's what Kamala Harris is. Kamala Harris, she's very much a guillotine meme. That's what she is. It's the glorification of punishment, a desire for revenge, a desire for destruction. And that if you look at the history of socialism around the world, the strength of socialism wasn't the guillotines, it wasn't the firing squads, it wasn't the persecution. That's not what people remember the strength of socialism being. They just did a poll. 75% of Russians say that the Soviet Union was the best time in their history, but they're not thinking that because of executions. This was from a PBS documentary. They interviewed a woman named Tatiana Fedorova.
Stalin set a task. Build this or build that. And thanks to the fact that people trusted him and this enthusiasm of young people, it was possible. Remember, this was a country where people were illiterate, lived in virtual darkness. wore birch bark shoes. Even now, I think it's like something out of a fairy tale. How was it possible at one of the most difficult times to raise these great construction sites? It was only possible through the unity of the people and the love of the people for their idol.
And the reason Stalin remains wildly popular in Russia, it's not because he executed people, it's because he mobilized them to build that country up from nothing. This was a country... He built some of the world's largest power plants, he wiped out illiteracy, and he built a modern industrial country. He raised millions of people up out of poverty. And then they fought off the Nazi invaders, and then they rebuilt the country again, and a few years later they were the first country in outer space. And the strength of socialism was not that it punished people and that it persecuted people, but rather that it enabled people to go out and build and construct. I've said to many people, I'm not a socialist because I want to destroy America. I'm a socialist because I want to save America. And we have to save America from the horrors that are being unfolded by an irrational system where profits come before people. I want to save America. I want to build a better world. If all the apparatus they've created for destroying people, for imprisoning people, for breaking people psychologically, could be utilized to build and to construct. The popular power were put in control of the means of production and control of the state apparatus in the United States, we could build something very, very beautiful.
They want you to be mad at Russia and China instead of the looters that are sitting not very far from here off Wall Street, who are actively getting bailouts in the billions, arguably even in the trillions, for their gambling debts. That's what we're here against, and that's why we're taking a stand for freedom of speech, because they're going after the Yahoo movement and anyone who stands against the imperialists, because they know we're a real threat and that's rising. They know we authentically represent the American people. They know that the American people are ready for a change and ready for an end to the wars. And that's why they're cracking down on our First Amendment. They're cracking down on our Fourth Amendment. They're cracking down on all of the civil liberties we know and love.
And so on. And so there's this hysteria within the transatlantic elite about information that they can't control. There's a hysteria about the possibility of Donald Trump returning to power and shutting down the Ukraine proxy war, and just all the chaos that Donald Trump brings. And we can't escape the fact that this is an election season in the U.S. and that the U.S. effectively manages the Nine Eyes and decides what takes place there, and that it is seeking to crack down on any information that it cannot control, which could potentially interfere with Kamala Harris's path to victory after the Democrats pulled off this coup of placing her there as the nominee. And you can see how they're controlling the press in the US. They have all the media, or we'll talk about this later, all the media organizations begging for an interview. She does one interview and it becomes this bonanza. She won't answer real questions. So it's all about the control of information, and you've risen to the level of a threat because you're breaking through. And I think when we look at the censorship requests that are being put into the big tech platforms, how we were our first live stream from the DNC, which was live from the protest. Wyatt Reed was on the ground. It was taken offline for a period. We were given a strike. Chris Hedges has had TikTok posts critical of Kamala Harris removed. Caleb Maupin had a series of essays he put up years ago about Kamala Harris, critical essays. It wasn't exactly a New York Times best-selling book. Amazon just without explanation removed his book. They're banning books that criticize Kamala Harris. And the White House has the power, as we know. Look up the case Murthy versus Missouri. This was from the COVID era. Look up all the censorship requests the Biden administration placed to Meta and other groups, including over the Hunter Biden laptop.
Yeah.
We know they were doing this. So now it seems clear the Kamala campaign is using the power of the Biden White House to crack down on information. And the U.S. national security state is using the power of Nine Eyes to just shut down all alternative voices, as many as they can, around the world, as well as trying to implicate the Palestine Solidarity Movement, which threatens Kamala's path to victory here, implicating them as somehow Iran-controlled.
Hey, I'll see you on tour in Las Vegas, Chicago, and Grand Rapids. In Chicago, it's stand-up and a live panel show. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets, and make sure you go to jimmydore.com.
Well, I got to tell you, the reason that I wrote this book is because I interacted with somebody. There was somebody I came across, and they had worked with Kamala Harris's father, Donald Harris. And they told me about that. And so I started doing research because, you remember when Barack Obama was running for president? We learned everything there was to know about, his mother, Ann Dunham, his father from Kenya, his grandparents, and everything, Jeremiah Wright, and the school in Indonesia. But no one knows anything about Kamala Harris. Nothing. I mean, we know nothing. We know that she was in Congress. She gave some great speeches, and now she's potentially the next president. We know nothing about her. Well, her father is Donald Harris, who is a Marxist economist who taught at Stanford University. He was an advisor to the government of Michael Manley, the kind of socialist president of Jamaica, kind of a Bernie Sanders president of Jamaica for a long time. And he and her are not on speaking terms. He denounced her presidential campaign in 2020. And there's a story there. There's a lot there. And no one wants to talk about it. I dug into it and did the research.
And why did he? Now, it had something to do with her disparaging Jamaicans as pot-smoking potheads, right?
Well, yes. So what happened was she was on a radio show called The Breakfast Club. And she was asked if she'd ever smoked marijuana. I don't know if you remember this. And she said, oh, yeah, that she smoked weed when she was in college. And then they asked her what music she listened to when she smoked weed. And she said Snoop Dogg. And that was interesting because Snoop Dogg had not yet released an album at the point when she was in college. So that's interesting. But regardless, she then said, half my family's from Jamaica. What do you think? And Donald Harris heard about this, and he didn't particularly care for it. And he published an essay called Reflections of a Jamaican Father. And in that essay, he reveals that it looks an awful lot like Kamala Harris lied in her autobiography. In her autobiography, The Truths We Hold, she says that when her parents divorced when she was a small child, the only thing they fought over was the books. Oh, doesn't that sound nice? They only fought over the books. Well, Donald Harris reveals they actually fought over who got custody of Kamala and her sister. There was a custody battle. And in that custody battle, they played up the stereotype of Jamaican men and black men as not good fathers, as pot smokers, as lazy, etc. And that stereotype that she invoked of Jamaicans as, joy-seeking, I forget the language he exactly used, but, that was used to deprive him of the ability to see his daughters. So he particularly took issue from it. He denounced her presidential campaign. He called it a travesty of identity politics, and he said he speaks for her entire Jamaican family. He did not attend her inauguration as vice president. Her mother is deceased, and Kamala Harris talks about her mother endlessly. Her mother is like a saint. But her father, nobody talks about the fact that she has this father who taught Marxist economics at Stanford University, etc. And there's a lot there if you dig into it. That is particularly surprising. If Barack Obama had a Marxist father, we would have heard about it endlessly. But nobody wants to talk about Kamala Harris and her estrangement from her father in Jamaica.
The thing is, we talked about this yesterday or the other day. It would be a mistake for Trump to come at her as being some kind of far left Marxist radical, because she's not. She's not. She is a very much an authoritarian enemy of black people, lock them up cop, and a tool of the military-industrial complex and Wall Street, along with Big Pharma. So she is a corporate puppet. She's all the bad things you would think of. I used to equate with being right wing, but now things are flipping around. So I don't know, those terms don't mean anything anymore. So, but yeah, she's not a far leftist. Would you consider her a far left? You wrote the book.
No, not at all. I mean, what is interesting, though, is that, her parents certainly were on the far left when they met each other.
Right.
They met each other at the free speech movement in Berkeley. They were part of, left-wing protests. They were most likely in some kind of communist organization at that time. We don't know exactly, but her father was a Marxist economist. They were both attending protests. But what's interesting, and I talk about this in the first chapter of the book, is that, Berkeley in the early 60s was not only the center of, protest movements for civil rights, the free speech movement at UC Berkeley, it was also the center of all kinds of CIA programs intended to manipulate left-wing politics. Starting with the downfall of McCarthy in the late 50s and early 60s, the U.S. government started covertly funding various leftist and communist groups while manipulating and crafting their politics to serve a different agenda. The Bay Area was the center of Project MK Ultra, where the CIA was distributing LSD, throughout civilian areas, just handing acid to people, etc. And there was all kinds of manipulation of the politics of the Bay Area. And her parents were heavily involved in that. And that is particularly interesting when you look into it. Kamala Harris talks about how when she grew up in the Bay Area, she attended a cultural center called Rainbow Sign. And it was a cultural center connected with James Baldwin and I believe Ralph Ellison and some other black intellectuals who were being promoted by the CIA as an alternative to the communist wing of black liberation. This was the time when you had the Black Panthers that were rising, Huey Newton in Oakland and others. And so this was a cultural center that was being funded and promoted to kind of push black radicals in a direction that was less dangerous to the establishment. And that's particularly interesting when you look into it. There's a lot there if you look into Kamala Harris and her background. And the fact that no one wants to talk about her father. And when it really gets down to it, the fact that the most epic political knockout was delivered in 2020 by Tulsi Gabbard. Do you remember that?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
We played
why
on.
did
I was there when that happened.
Yeah, it was amazing. I've never seen, she just used her very limited time on the debate stage to just go over Kamala's record as a vicious prosecutor.
Hey, I'll see you on tour in Las Vegas, Chicago, and Grand Rapids. In Chicago, it's stand-up and a live panel show. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets, and make sure you go to jimmydore.com.
Every single day, $18 million of our tax money goes to fund the criminals in that building over there and in occupied Palestine, the Israeli regime. Every single day, $18 million. And I have a copy of today's issue of the Wall Street Journal, and it says here that 1 in 4 bridges in the United States are not secure. It says here that urban highway congestion costs over $100 billion annually. The United States is crumbling. People are unemployed. They are closing hospitals and they are closing schools, but yet they have more and more money for the murderers in Tel Aviv. That's unacceptable. As the U.S. becomes more and more of a police state, and the civil liberties the U.S. government is always bragging about get stripped and stripped away, you can't help but admit that the U.S. is starting to look more and more like Israel. The cops who choked Eric Garner to death, the New York City Police Department is trained in Israel. The same corporation that manufactured the rubber bullets that were fired against protesters in Ferguson, Missouri, manufactures the bullets that were fired on protesters in Palestine. The struggle against Zionism, the struggle against the Israeli criminals is not just a struggle in one part of the world, it's a global struggle. It's a struggle against the bankers in London and the bankers on Wall Street who are destroying the world, and it's a struggle against global capitalism. Thank you very much. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free.
So an email has recently come to light, an exchange between Jeffrey Leeds and former Secretary of State Colin Powell, in which he acknowledges that Israel has, quote, he says 200 nuclear weapons. And the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty has not been signed by Israel. Under U.S. law, the United States should cut off support to Israel because it's a nuclear power that has not signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, according to Colin Powell, correct?
Shouldn't you ask Colin Powell that? I'm not going to speak to this particular traffic, and I'm certainly not going to discuss.
Israel doesn't have nuclear weapons?
I'm certainly not going to discuss matters of intelligence from the podium, and I'm not. I have no comment on that.
Okay. Well, the email says the boys in Tehran know Israel has 200, all we targeted on Tehran, and we have thousands. I mean, that seems to indicate that there's a knowledge of an Israeli nuclear program, which would make U.S. aid to Israel illegal.
I think I've answered your question.
Okay. Well, let me ask. Is that, do I have the correct understanding of U.S. law that we're not allowed to support a nuclear power that has not signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty?
Look, we obviously support the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. I'm not a legal expert on all the tenets of it, and I'm certainly not going to speak about the details that you've revealed here in this email traffic. That would be inappropriate for me to discuss one way or the other. I'm not going to do it.
There are sanctions imposed on North Korea in response to their nuclear proliferation. There were sanctions put on Iran in response to allegations of nuclear proliferation. And now we have this email from Colin Powell saying that Israel has 200 nuclear weapons. Why is Israel not facing any consequence for this?
That's a very colorful way of getting back to the same question you just asked me. But I'm going to refer you back to the transcript when you see it this afternoon to what I said before to your question. Saeed?
You're familiar with this email, right?
I'm not.
Oh.
I have not seen it. I can't speak to the email, and frankly, even if I'd seen it, sir, I wouldn't engage in that kind of a discussion from the podium.
When you think about the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, that points to an aspect of our movement that it's really important to understand. There's a famous writer named Sherwood Anderson. You ever heard of Sherwood Anderson? He wrote Winesburg, Ohio. He was a novelist. And at one point, Sherwood Anderson was asked, what's the difference between a socialist and a communist? What's the difference? And he said, I don't know the technical difference, but it seems to me like the communists, they're the ones who mean it. And what he was pointing to was the fact that when we do something, we really do it. In the early 1930s, the understanding was that the Social Democrats and the Reformists, the sellout leaders who had sold out the revolution in Germany, that were leading workers to oppose the Soviet Union in the name of socialism, that they were the main threat. And it was necessary to expose the Social Democrats and the Reformists. And so when that was the line of the Communist International, we didn't just half-ass oppose the Social Democrats. We didn't just sort of oppose the Social Democrats. We went all in. We really opposed the Social Democrats, because we understood that that was what was necessary. And so all over the world, communists went into class against class mode to expose the Social Democrats and build a united front from below, because we understood that that was the correct tactic. And then we know that after the rise of Hitler, and as the situation changed, the line changed, and it became correct to align with the Social Democrats in a united front against fascism. And when that line changed, we didn't just half-ass align with them against fascism. What did we do? We built the Abraham Lincoln Brigade and went and fought in Spain. We had the Battle of Cable Street in London. We built huge anti-fascist mobilizations. We are the reason Roosevelt won the 1936 presidential election. When we do something, we do it hard. We do it hard. There was a labor leader who once remarked, he said, if it's 3 in the morning at your labor union hall and there's 2 guys running the mimeograph machine, you can bet at least one of them is a communist. And the people who criticize our movement, right, this is a really common critique from Trotskyites, is they'll say, well, hey, they zigzag, they're always reversing themselves. They do this and then they do that. Yeah, if the situation changes in 24 hours, the tactics must also change in 24 hours. And sometimes what's correct on Monday is not correct on Tuesday, and it's not correct on Wednesday, and you have to change your tactics. And when you're as dedicated as we are, and when you never half-ass these things, when you take it very seriously, when you are fully committed to achieving what we aim to achieve, it can look a little strange to people who don't get it. And they can go, well, one day you're running this way, and the next day you're running this way. Yes, and every way that we run, we're running hard because we understand that it's necessary and that it must be done.
That some people came here knowing not a single word in Russian, and now they know many. One young person from Kamchatka is sitting in back rows. He's probably unaware of what has been talked about. Please introduce yourself.
I'm the leader of the United States delegation. I'm representing the Center for Political Innovation. And I would like to just thank you from the bottom of my heart for that dynamic interview you gave to Tucker Carlson, in which you showed many, many young Americans a different kind of leadership, because our politicians and our leaders in the United States, they speak in sound bites, they speak in terms of scandal and gossip, but you presented a long-term vision, a scientific view of statecraft, and by getting through to young Americans, you made a difference. Many people who would never have listened to anything you had to say or heard another perspective heard you because of that interview. Now, getting to my question, things between our two countries are not good at this point. You know, before we left, we had to have a press conference at the United Nations. We are concerned about being prosecuted. There are 3 Americans that have already been charged and are facing prosecution, possibly 15 years in prison, simply because they attended a conference like this in Russia, the Uhuru movement they're called. And we are concerned because I know that I speak for the majority of the American people when I say that we do not want our tax money dumped into this conflict in Ukraine any longer. We do not want our country to continue to deteriorate internally while our leaders waste money on prolonging this war. I'm frightened by what the Biden administration is doing, not just in Ukraine, but also on Taiwan and on the Korean Peninsula. And I really do see gatherings like this as a potential road to peace. And what I have seen at this festival has blown my mind. The amount of young volunteers that you have here, people who have stepped up, who love their country and want to just come forward and put together dynamic events like this. What kind of role can events like this and young diplomacy activities like this play in helping set the stage for maybe changing the dangerous direction our leaders in the United States are taking things against the majority of the wishes of the majority of the people of our country? Thank you.
The United States of America is a huge and unique country. In its own way, over 300 years, in just 300 years, which is a small period of time compared to our history, but thanks to the talents of the Americans, it became a superpower, which is an obvious fact. We know outstanding American politicians, we know outstanding American business people, cultural activists, which is an obvious fact. We used to be allies during 2 world wars as we fought Nazism and fascism. What happened recently? After the war, after the alliance, the United States and the Soviet Union started dividing the world, and they did so successfully. And based on this balance of powers, they created international relations and created the modern system of international law. Then the Soviet Union ceased to exist for a number of reasons. I will not go into detail, but they were mainly internal reasons. There is one superpower remaining, represented by your country. The way your elites use this monopoly to global domination is dubious. In my opinion, the United States failed to bear this burden of responsibility that they happen to bear. They created monopoly, strengthened it. I don't mean the American people, I mean the ruling elites. While strengthening their monopoly, they soon faced a situation where the overwhelming majority of countries disliked it. And so, step by step, it became obvious to everyone that there is resistance to the forming global order. Many, including your allies, They are keeping their silence here. They are afraid of speaking up because they're dependent on major economies, on mass media. There are a lot of dependencies, but believe me, I know what I'm talking about. Even allies dislike it too. And so they faced failures and disturbances. The ruling elites of the United States, after achieving the monopoly of power, decided that the previous system of international relations that was built on the outcomes of World War II is no longer satisfying for them because the balance of power evolved, and hence they decided to change the international legal order. And when it became clear that not everyone is okay with this, by this I mean Iraqi developments, they happened without UN Security Council sanctions. The same applies to Syria, Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, without going into detail about root causes. There were no decisions or resolutions of UN Security Council. The United States did let this genie get out of the bottle. If they did so, why can't other countries protect their national interests in the same way? As for Yugoslavia, my counterpart told me on multiple occasions, yes, we did so without UN Security Council resolution, but there was a waging 8-year war, bloodshed, something must be done. When Russia, however, decided to protect their people in the Donbass, which faced a war with elderly, with children being killed, why cannot Russia do the same while protecting their own people, not some thousands of kilometers away from their national borders, instead on the border of their own country, and people were waiting for us to help without going into detail. My point is to understand that the world cannot be controlled from one pole, and which is detrimental to that pole itself as it undermines the foundation. And in the interview given to your compatriot, Mr. Carlson, I said that dollar is being undermined as they forbid to use dollar for settlements. They seek quick results. Instead of gaining one, they only undermine their national currency. They attain an opposite result, and this is true for many areas. In my opinion, this is a wrong policy. But the youth, returning to your question, can do many things without interfering in domestic processes, without describing or giving descriptions of the behavior of presidential candidates. It is just a part of the national culture, but youth can contribute in building state-to-state relations. What would be the procedure? They can just speak up domestically, within law, within their constitution. It is the only way, the only option. In no way do we call upon any activities of disobedience, but it is a possibility to speak up in their own country. And I think this is a way to go. In my opinion, this is going to pave the way for non-state forms of contact in order to create conditions for improving relations on state-to-state level too. Thank you very much for your question.
So as Congress makes up its mind on whether to take military action against Syria, anti-war groups are getting ready to stage protests in Times Square today. Rosa Flores joining me live now from New York. So Rosa, tell us more about the protests unfolding there in New York.
Yeah, well, those protesters are making their way here to Times Square, and I'm actually here with one of the organizers, Caleb from the International Action Center. And I know that you guys are expecting dozens, if not hundreds, of people here. But first of all, explain to us kind of what is your mission? Why are you guys here?
The last thing we need right now is a new war against Syria. Right now, they're cutting food stamps, hospitals are closing, schools are being shut down. There's a budget crisis in this country. We do not need more money for a new war against Syria. Every one of the cruise missiles they would send would cost over $1 million. That could be teachers that could be hired. That could be hospitals that could be opening. But instead, it's blowing up and killing people in another country, and that's not right.
Now, let me ask you about the support that you're getting, because from what I understand, lots of organizations are coming out of the woodwork and asking to be involved. Tell us a little bit about the involvement of other organizations that perhaps would not be, in this case, participating in something like this.
Well, 89% of the U.S. public is opposed to this war. People in this country overwhelmingly oppose an attack on Syria. But that won't mean anything unless people do something about it. If people aren't in the streets and organizing and demonstrating and making clear to the government that they will not let this war pass, that won't mean anything, because we've seen so many times the government not listen to the people and go to war. I don't believe what's coming out about this chemical weapons attack. I have a lot of questions about it. There are a lot of facts that just aren't adding up. And we've heard about weapons of mass destruction before. There's so many lies to take us into war. We don't need a new war. We need jobs, schools, education, and not a new war against the Syrian people. And these rebels that our government and our tax dollars are paying for, they're not good folks, and they're doing awful things there in Syria, and we should not be supporting these rebels in Syria.
Right now in this city, hospitals are closing, schools are closing, all kinds of resources that people in this city use to survive are being shut down. Well, what are they talking about doing? They're talking about a new war against Syria. How much money is every single one of these missiles going to cost? At least $1 million. That could be teachers, that could be nurses, that could be doctors. But instead, it's going to a war. Do we want that? No. And now, you know, there have already been 100,000 people killed in this war in Syria. And they've been killed because our tax dollars are going to fund the Syrian rebels. A lot of these Syrian rebels aren't even from Syria. They're from places like Qatar, places like Jordan, places like Libya, and they've been shipped in. Syria was a peaceful country, and now there's a civil war going on. And the United Nations has reported that these rebels in Syria, funded by our tax dollars, are recruiting children as young as 11 and 12, and they're recruiting them and using them to kill people in Syria. Chemical weapons have been used by the Syrian rebels. They've used them. Carla Del Ponte from the United Nations has confirmed that. They're using sarin gas, and they're killing innocent people in Syria with our tax dollars. And the reason that they're talking about striking Syria right now, the reason they're talking about striking is because those rebels are losing. Why are they losing? They're losing because the people of Syria don't support them. They don't support foreign importing insurgents trying to tear up their country. And that is why Obama wants to send the missiles to do what the rebels can't do, because they don't have support on the ground. We want the people of Syria to run Syria. We want money for jobs and schools and education, not a new war. I'm with FIST, Fight Imperialism, stand together, and you can check us out. Thank you.
After the rioting was done, U.S. media kind of forgot about those communities. Well, Uhuru, they went out there because they saw black and brown people like themselves that were out there protesting and rioting, and they stayed there. And they've been there since 2014, providing services in the community, giving these young people in the community something constructive to do, not just go out and break shit to raise awareness about the conditions they're in, but ways to actually feed people and serve the community. And they've been there in St. Louis since 2014 doing constructive work. They have really escalated these programs. They have a farmer's market. They provide classes and services to pregnant mothers, and in particular in St. Louis, Missouri, and in St. Petersburg, Florida. They're trying to undo the damage that the U.S. Department of Justice and the state police and the local police and all the forces have been doing in communities like Ferguson, Missouri. And at the same time that they've done this community work, the African People's Socialist Party has also taken a firm anti-imperialist stance. They support China. They support Russia. They support Cuba. They support Iran. And when the United States started piling weapons into Kiev, they defended Russia's right to intervene.
This defensive war in Ukraine that Russia is actually waging against world colonial powers, not Ukraine as a single entity, but the U.S. and all colonial powers who have an interest in colonially dominating African people right here in this country and around the world and extracting resources from the majority of peoples on the planet. That system, this current system, is in severe crisis, and they cannot rule in the same old way.
Because of that, their homes were raided. Then months later, the federal government came out with an indictment, and it's charging them with being Russian agents. And it's trying to allege that the election campaign that they ran in St. Petersburg, Florida, was somehow interference in the U.S. electoral process.
4 activists associated with the People's Democratic Uhuru Movement and the African People's Socialist Party have been indicted by the U.S. Department of Justice. The indictment from the U.S. Department of Justice accuses them of spreading Russian propaganda and cites simply some web conferences that they had, some Zoom meetings, some emails they sent out, as well as the fact that they have run routine election campaigns. Is this of concern to the Secretary General as an attack on human rights, freedom of assembly, etc.?
I frankly was not aware of the case before you mentioned it. Let me look into it and I will get back to you.
What's going on in Africa is directly connected to what's going on here. What's going on in Ukraine is connected to what's going on in Harlem. You know what I'm saying? It's an international global economy that's all connected.
Because they go to conferences in Russia, this constitutes Russian meddling in the elections. The whole thing is ridiculous. It's completely, utterly ridiculous. They've been running these campaigns for years, since before I was born. Back in the 1970s, they were running people for office. Their platform of reparations, I mean, Marianne Williamson, she's a major Democrat candidate. She also says she believes in reparations. I mean, it's not a unique message that they have in that sense, but they have been targeted because they're doing what you're supposed to do. I mean, you know, at all of our meetings, we have a picture of Fred Hampton up on the stage because Fred Hampton, he built a free breakfast program. He organized what he called a rainbow coalition, uniting low-income people, white, black, brown, Arab, Latino, into one organization, you know, trying to build up community empowerment, trying to do community service projects while teaching Marxism and socialism. You know, we look at Fred Hampton as a great example of the American revolutionary tradition. And, you know, the African People's Socialist Party and the Uhuru movement, you know, they don't like that we wave the American flag. They don't like that we consider ourselves patriotic. They have their own kind of unique analysis. They talk about what they call the colonial mode of production. That's not traditional Marxist thinking. And we don't agree with them on a number of issues. But it doesn't matter. We support them.
We all have to stand up and oppose the ideology of division and support an ideology of unity based upon our material interests, you know what I'm saying, to work together.
People who can't understand that, people who can't get past, you know, this or that, like, we got to put aside our differences and say that if they come for them, they come for all of us. They go after them, they got to deal with all of us. That needs to be the attitude among anti-imperialists.
Bit of wisdom that was passed down to me. You know, we can be critical of different figures, but Sam Marcy, an important leader of communism in the post-war years, he would often talk about how at the anti-war protests that happened during the 1960s, where you'd have hundreds of thousands of people marching against the Vietnam War, there'd be these beautiful puppets that they would build. They'd have puppets of, you know, Richard Nixon with his money or whatever. They'd have puppets of the heroic Vietnamese people fighting for their liberation, these beautiful puppets. That there were whole communities of people, and they weren't members of any communist group, but they were against the Vietnam War and had a general leftist, anti-imperialist view, and they made it their mission that when there was a big anti-war rally, they would come together and they would make these beautiful works of art as their contribution to opposing the war in Vietnam. And there were whole communities that built these puppets. It was their project, their way of being creative, of building community and coming together. And there were couples who met each other through the process of making those puppets. And a couple of years later, they were there making the puppets with their little kids that they had just had. And there were whole communities of people, and they made it their mission. This is something that we can do. Imperialism is the enemy of humanity. The Vietnam War is horrible, and this is something we can do. We have a 9-to-5 job, we have a regular life, but this is something that we can do. And we can do it together, and we can bond, and that's beautiful. And what Sam Marcy would tell his followers is that that community that built those puppets, that's 1,000 times more valuable than some kid who thinks he's Lenin. You know what I'm saying? A community like that has longevity. People are doing that their whole life and they're taking on a contribution. And that you know, if you've been doing this as long as I have, which is, you know, not that long, relatively speaking, but you realize that there are some people who come around and they see that they don't get the immediate result that they want. They see that they don't, you know, they don't fulfill their dictator fantasy that they have. You know, they see that you know, they see that this isn't exactly the way they want to resolve their parental issues or whatever. And then they go away after a year. They go away after a year. For a year, they know more than everybody. No one knows anything better. They can debate everybody, but they're gone. For those people who came together to build the puppets and build community around it and learn to work together, they keep going. And generation after generation, year after year, they build those puppets. And that is what we need to build with the Center for Political Innovation. We need a network of people who are committed to opposing imperialism, who learn to trust each other and rely on each other and carry out operations, build some beautiful puppets, some beautiful artwork, put on beautiful conferences, and keep this movement alive. That is what we need to build. We need a network of people who love each other and trust each other and can work together and can serve the purpose of representing the anti-imperialist movement in America. That is what we need, and that is what I want us to build with the Center for Political Innovation.
At the end, I did start to get passionate. I told some stories from my own past and how I got involved in it and what this movement and socialism has really meant in my life, how grateful I am for the older communists who mentored me. I've made a lot of sacrifices to be where I am, but I've also gotten a lot of help and mentorship over the years, and I want to acknowledge that.
Really one of the most interesting nights of my life, which is when I was invited to speak at the hall where Malcolm X was assassinated in Harlem. There was a political prisoners benefit. And it was a political prisoners benefit. There were supporters of people from the Move 9 who were still locked up at that point. There were supporters of Mumia Abu Jamal and Jamil Al-Amin. And I walked into this auditorium and they had like a light where at the spot where Malcolm X had died, and I was on a panel and I was like the one white guy there. People were joking about the flyer and they're like, one of these speakers is a little bit different than all the other ones. But, I was the only white guy there, and I looked out on that audience. I spoke for like 3 minutes. It was a very short presentation. But when I looked out on that crowd of several hundred people in there, I thought, I am speaking to a group of veterans. I looked out on that crowd because these were black liberation fighters. These were Black Panthers. These were, Black Liberation Army former members. These were black nationalists and others, and in walkers. And when people were speaking, they were shaking and having flashbacks, and there were a lot of tears in their eyes. And I thought, this is like a veterans gathering. This is like speaking at the VFW, right? And I mean, there's rooms like this in Ireland, in Northern Ireland. There's rooms like this in South Africa. There's rooms like this in people's Korea, and this is a group of people who have made great sacrifices, and they're there to support their comrades who are still locked up, and they're in this for real, and they've seen it. And I looked out on that crowd and I thought, again, these are people who understand how serious it is, and this is how important all of this can be.
Communism will save America. China has created a system that's raising up its poorest people, its peasants, raised out of poverty. They're creating a system that gets to the base of the economy and recreates it so that the working class can rise. Unlike in this country, where homeless people sleep a block from the White House.
After the summit, we protested against the Museum of the Victims of Communism, which is nothing but spreading pro-imperialist lies, demonizing the history of the Soviet Union and China.
So trying to fight something that literally involves circumstantial change. Well, instead of fighting against people around the world, we should be fighting against those bankers who set up that situation. We should be building a coalition of people with different perspectives. We're going to stand up against the big banks and corporations. That's what I think.
You're looking at Country Joe and the Fish. Little known fact, there was a band that played at Woodstock called Country Joe and the Fish Band. And the reason they have that name, according to every source that I can check, is because their parents were members of the Communist Party USA, and they picked the name for some pretty interesting reasons. Now, this guy was Country Joe because he was from Georgia, from the countryside. He grew up in a small village. He was the son of a bootmaker. And this guy was the Fish because one of his most well-known quotations, before he even started his organization, he just walked 300 miles through the countryside, talking to every person he could meet, asking them about the conditions of their life, engaging with them. He says, how should we judge whether or not a youth is a revolutionary? How can we tell? Well, there can only be one criteria, namely, whether or not he's willing to integrate himself with the broad masses of the workers and the peasants, and he does so in practice. The masses are the water, and the revolutionaries are the fish. Country Joe and the Fish.
We are educating, we're agitating, we're demonstrating, and we're normal people. That's the best part. pretty normal.
Let's fix our government right here at home to provide for working people before we go 7,000 miles away to waste young, precious lives over something as dumb as anti-communism.
Afterwards, a few of us went to New York City to protest against Tsai Ing-wen, the Taiwan president.
All the polls show the American people don't want a new war. The American people are sick and tired of our money being wasted on bombs and weapons and destruction, provoking a war with China, provoking a war with Russia, while our dreams are derailing. People in the United States are suffering.
Tsai Ing-wen came to the United States to beg for more weapons and to demonize China. And the Center for Political Innovation, we were in the streets of New York City confronting the Taiwan president and her effort to spread war.
China is not our enemy. China is not our enemy. China is not our enemy. Get out of our country. Stop trying to sell war in our country. Stop trying to sell war in our country. We don't want a new war with China. We love America and we don't want a new war with China. China is not our enemy. Stop trying to sell war. Get out of our country. Stop trying to sell war.
You know, what we did with Tsai Ing-wen, that went viral in Chinese media. Over 1 million shares. I was interviewed about it by Global Times. The Global Times, one of the main publications in China, made a point of highlighting the Center for Political Innovation, finding out about our work and why we do what we do. That was really, really great.
I'm a patriotic American. I love my country.